Hello everybody, my name is Jane Phillips. I'm from the Centre of Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. Today I'm talking to Victoria Police Assistant Commissioner Dean McWhirter of the Family Violence Command about responding to adolescent family violence in the home. Assistant Commissioner Dean McWhirter has had a diverse career during his 38 years in Victoria Police. He's worked at various supervisory levels across Victoria Police, including the Intelligence and Covert Support Department, Transit Safety Division, Professional Standards Command, Road Policing Enforcement Division, and People Development Command. Dean is also the holder of the Australian Police Medal. In March 2015, Dean was appointed as the Assistant Commissioner Family Violence Command. This command was the first of its kind in policing jurisdiction in Australia, and he's committed to cross-sector understanding and collaboration regarding family violence. Welcome, Dean, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
My pleasure, Jane.
Thanks. The Royal Commission into Family Violence found that adolescents using violence in the home is a significant problem. However, parents and carers are quite reluctant to report the violence to police. Parents often fear that reporting might result in the adolescent child being convicted of a crime or result in the removal of siblings for the home. And in that same report, the Royal Commission recommended that the use of dedicated youth resource officers by Victoria Police. I'd like to start today by asking about some of the changes you've seen in the areas of youth violence in the home since you came into the command and into the role of Assistant Commissioner of Family Violence.
Certainly. Look, I suppose in some respects, sadly, there hasn't been much change. The level of family violence committed by youth perpetrators in the home continues. We haven't seen any significant shift in that at all. In fact, it's continued to increase over the last period of time since I've been in this role within Victoria Police. The changes have been in terms of the identification of the issues through some research, and certainly the Royal Commission brought that out. But in very practical terms, in terms of responding to what is happening with young children at risk and families at risk, there has not been much system change at all. And I suppose this is my concern from a member of Victoria Police, where police are very much part of the first response in many instances, where our approach, whilst we're a little bit more educated and we understand family violence dynamics much better than we ever did before in terms of our education base and also our reporting of family violence, since we've changed our system of reporting of family violence, the actual system response hasn't changed. We are quite open to trying to enhance our response and enhance the system response, but practically we're a little bit limited because we're a policing organisation, we're an enforcement agency, and that's what we do. We're not a service agency that can address a whole lot of things that are happening with families and risks that's occurring within families. We're essentially and sadly pretty much a blunt instrument, and whilst we're happy to be something different, but we can't be all things to all people, and the system needs to change if we're going to get some really effective and positive outcomes for young people who are at risk, but also families who are at risk. And I think that we need to put it in a whole range of contexts about understanding what this all looks like. We know that there are an awful lot of young children exposed to family violence. The research tells us that if young people are exposed to that, it has significant consequences into their future development in terms of their productivity, their opportunity for employment, their opportunity around education, and the damaging impact that has on, or potentially has on, future relationships that they may have as young adults, but also growing into being adults themselves. So we know that, something in the vicinity of recorded documentation in the last 5 years, it's always been over 30% of young people being exposed to family violence in the home. How that then translates into those young people also becoming perpetrators of family violence is also a significant concern for us. So the issue is broader than just the issue of the actual act of youth perpetrators in the home. It's also about what is going on in the home much earlier before they actually become young perpetrators. So the system response for me is very, very broad. For me, I would like to see a total reframing of the system about how we identify families at risk at the earliest opportunity before we get to the stage of having young perpetrators in the home. What are those services that can support young families with young children, that can support them going through very challenging times of being parents and circumstances? And how do we then prevent young children becoming young perpetrators? So we can deal with the system response or the immediacy response in terms of the crisis, and that's what Victoria Police is about, responding to crisis. But how do we prevent that crisis from happening in the first instance? And for me, that's the change that I see that needs to be done on top of dealing with what we currently see and are addressing around adolescent violence in the home.
Mm, absolutely. And I think that the Royal Commission and also the PIPA report brought up some of those concerns that you have as well. You mentioned that you have been reading some additional reports that are providing evidence on the family violence in the home, and that it's increasing. From the Victoria Police perspective, is there reporting or statistics that actually show this in a statistical evidence-based way?
Yes, there are. So we, in terms of our reporting, we certainly report on the age of perpetrators that commit family violence crime, and so we know that in the last 5 years that's increased. So at the moment, for 2019, you're talking about over 5,500 youth perpetrators under 17 being recorded in terms of family violence reports, and that's about 7% of all family violence reports, where somebody under 17 is identified as the actual respondent or perpetrator. What that means is that's a steady increase over the last 5 years. Significantly, and probably I would say a little bit hidden for most people, is that 1/3 of all those youth perpetrators are actually young females. And so it's an interesting statistic, and it means that year on year on since the last 5 years, we've had over 4,000 now into 5,000 every year. So you're talking now 20,000 young people who have been identified as youth perpetrators in the last 5 years that we know of.
Yeah.
And that's a huge amount of people. And now, what's happened to that young person in 5 years ago, who might have been 12 is now 17, who was 15, who is now 20? What are their behaviours? What's impacting on them in terms of that they were a youth perpetrator 5 years ago? How is their behaviour changed? What's their relationship change? What's the impact that's having in terms of their productivity, as I said earlier, their employment, their education, and their relationships? So we know that youth perpetrating, the identification of youth perpetrators is increasing.
Yeah.
We know it's at least 7% of all family violence reports being a youth perpetrator, and that's certainly a concern for us. And when you put it in the terms of youth perpetrators are roughly in the average age of around between late 14 to early 15s, that means that, like I said, 5 years ago, that 15-year-old is now 20 years old. Yeah. And what's happening with that young person's life now. So, yeah, we know it's a concern. We know it's growing. But as I said earlier, for me, we can deal with the crisis response in terms of that 15-year-old on the average. But how do we get back to when that family was in crisis, when that child was basically a child of between 0 to 3 or 0 to 5 in age, to prevent that 15?
So it's also about the follow-up from different services and how you can connect into them and provide support in that sort of way as well.
Yes, and police are part of that, but we're not the whole system. And we can't provide that level of in-depth case management, if you like, for families. It's just not our role. We respond to the crisis in terms of the safety and the risk issues.
Yeah. Yep. And talking about that, can you tell us about some of the practical problems VicPol and the officers on the ground have faced or are facing when they respond to adolescents who are using violence in the home?
Yeah, certainly. Look, the the probably the biggest issue for frontline members when they are in a situation where they've had to arrest and take a young person out of their family environment and interview them for a family violence crime is about finding a place for these young people to go after they've been interviewed.
Yeah.
There's no housing support. We have to rely, the members have to rely on negotiating with another family member. Quite often, in a general sense, it's usually a grandparent, and about trying to place that child safely in another environment. And they're at risk, they're also, they're at risk as much as the family's at risk. And we struggle to locate somewhere to place them safely. There is definitely a lack of support agencies to intervene in an immediate response to work with that young person and a family to immediately start to address their issues and behaviours. There's no immediacy of response here. If we interview a child, well, they're either going to be charged or summonsed, and they're going to end up in court. There's no immediate intervention for that child to start supporting them to address their behaviours, and there's no immediate response to start working with the family to try and repair that relationship in any other way as well. And so that's a really challenging issue for us. One of the practical things is, where do we put a young person in the police station?
Yeah.
You've got a young person who's vulnerable, our police stations are designed around interview rooms and all sorts of things that are probably quite harsh and sterile. We're dealing with a young person who is still at risk and vulnerable. Where do we put them? And the members feel uncomfortable about that, but they've still got to interview them, still go through that process. Members are also really challenged by what to do with them. Are we going to just summons them, or are we going to charge them? Charging a young person is it's a hard, tough thing to do. It may be necessary for a whole range of reasons, but they are challenged by what's the best thing for that young person and that family in terms of that issue. The other thing is about the immediate risk to the family and the potential for ongoing risk to the family or person, the affected family member, because we can't issue a family violence safety notice to that young person. So we can't put any immediate conditions around that person, that young person, to say you can't go back into the home, you can't contact the person that you've offended against. We can't put conditions around them unless we actually charge them and put them on bail.
Yeah.
So that's a real restriction. So there's nothing for us that we can intervene, and it's very, very difficult for frontline members to get an interim intervention order unless we can absolutely guarantee where that person is actually going to be living and staying. So the system doesn't help us to put an intervention around that child and support the family either. We struggle to get interim intervention orders. And what the members are also saying and finding is that once that young person gets over 16 years of age, the amount of system support drops off dramatically.
Yeah.
And so they become, all these challenges compound when they're over 16 years of age. So there's some of the practical things that members are grappling with every time they get involved with adolescent violence in the home and have to deal with a young perpetrator.
Yeah, it sounds as though you rely heavily on an informal kinship care arrangement too, in hopes of keeping them within the family community as such.
Well, in a general sense, yes, but there are quite often situations where that just doesn't exist. And so it's about where do we find the most appropriate, what most appropriate is for that young person that they can actually go and stay. Because in a situation where we've arrested them and taken them to the police station, we don't have a holding power once we've actually interviewed them. Yeah. So we don't have the capacity to hold them in the police station, and we don't have the capacity legislatively to actually hold them and move them to somewhere else. So it's a really challenging issue for members dealing with a young person.
Yeah.
Because the person who you need consent from is in most cases the person they've offended against.
Yeah.
So that's a really, really difficult situation for members to grapple with, to try and find a significant family member who's prepared to take that that young person on, knowing that with a conflict within the family environment, and quite often there isn't another person. They've got to find another somebody, whoever that somebody is, a responsible person where they can go and stay.
So what would you consider to be a positive outcome for the young person?
Well, in as I sort of probably indicated earlier, is that for a positive outcome would be where there was some immediate intervention that provides safety for that child, but also safety for the family, and also where we ultimately may not need police involvement to the level that might lead to a criminal charge. That we can have a system response that says, here is a young person in crisis, here is a family in crisis. Our role is to immediately intervene to make sure people are safe and to sort of diffuse that critical response or critical issue. But where's the next level of immediate response to actually start working with that young person and that family so the crisis is averted in the sense that they can work together safely. They can work out a way to actually not break up that family dynamic and start working with them. For us, as I said, we're a blunt instrument.
Yeah.
We have no way of providing that level of quite considered, as I said, case management around addressing risk and safety issues in the home once we've been involved in that process. So we can't deal with understanding the behaviours and the family violence, family conflict in the home. That has to be done with a system that has that skill and ability to work with the young people and families, which we just don't have. It's not our role. We're part of the system, but we're not the system that provides all that. So a positive outcome would be where we would have a safe place for a young person to go if we had to take them out of the home. Try not to criminalise their behaviour, because the compounding impact of criminalising their behaviour as a child has a massive impact on their employment history, potentially their productivity as a community member, as I say, their education, their future relationships. That's a blunt instrument, even though it may well be necessary. But what other option is available to Victoria Police when we have a situation where we're responding to, in a very generic sense, somebody's been assaulted?
I'm wondering if there are things that you believe need to be considered or done to actually support the ability or improve the ability of your officers to respond to this type of violence.
So, look, for Victoria Police, we have very much taken the view that education is critical if we're going to improve our family violence response more broadly, but also in relation to children. So in our first, and we've done that quite significantly in terms of identifying high-risk indicators, the dynamics of family violence with our initial education of our frontline members, which has really predominantly never been done before, and we've progressively done that, and we've rolled out a new family violence report which also identifies children as well, in terms of recognising the risks to children. We then now have to do that next level of understanding about really understanding that the dynamics that relate to children specifically. So that will be our next level of education for members, so they do have a better understanding about what is going on in terms of young people who commit adolescent violence in the home, and how they need to engage and react to that environment that makes it safe for the young person, the family, and also the members that are attending. And also the next level of that is about local policing responses, understanding what agency support is within their local area that they can call on, and to start to develop those partnerships. But it's very, very difficult when those services don't work the same hours that Victoria Police work. So we can design a model, but if everybody's not working at the same time, it makes it very difficult for us to support young people and a family who are in crisis.
Yeah, I think that there are very few organisations that work 24/7 like you do. Yeah.
So education is the key for us to at least get a better understanding about young people and the challenge that they face in the dynamics of family violence. So our understanding of family violence is better and enhanced. It needs to continue to improve, but specifically around children is something we'll continue to pick up and work on for members in their understanding.
sounds like that you've made a great start to making changes, which is fabulous. What are your thoughts about how we as a professional community could be supporting or working with the families involved in this type of violence? You've mentioned a couple of different instances where the system doesn't seem to actually respond in a way that is appropriate or respond in a timely way.
Yep.
Are they some of the things that we in this particular sector need to be looking at changing so we can put this support in place as well?
Look, I think that there's, as I said before, I think there's two parts to it. One is how do we respond to a crisis response in terms of a young person who's exhibiting violence in the home, and how do we intervene at the earliest opportunity with support to, one, initially to make both the young person safe but also the family safe, and what does that look like? How do we intervene quickly to try and identify and start working with that young person about what are the things that are actually causing that behaviour to occur? Remembering, it could be, something that's already happened in the family dynamic. They could be being bullied at school. They could be victims of sexual offences. There could be a range of things going on with that child that hasn't been disclosed or identified, and we just don't know. Well, policing may elicit some of that information through questions and answers, but really that therapeutic environment that other agencies have the capacity to provide is the key thing that is missing in the immediacy of the response. We can't put a child in crisis, we can't wait 2 or 3 days for an intervention. It's not, it's not a practical way to sort of support a child who's at risk, who now is living with a grandparent or couch surfing or wherever that young person is, because we don't have a supportive housing model that actually supports a young child in crisis.
Yeah.
So unless we get in there early and start working with them immediately, that child could be lost to us in terms of trying to support them and take them out of the dramatic and critical situation that they're in. So I think that's reframing the immediacy of the response. And as I said, the second part of it is reframing the system response. How do we identify families who are in crisis early, at the earliest opportunity, as I said, from 0 to 3 as a child or 0 to 5, what are those early indicators we can start working that the system sees, and how do we link those system things that either health see, education see, child maternal health, the health system, education, policing, council, whoever sees those triggers at the earliest opportunity can say, hang on, we've got a situation here of a young family in crisis or needs some help, some intervention to prevent what we ultimately see as adolescent violence in the home, because otherwise we're going to be forever responding to and putting in place a system response that is just responding to the symptoms.
Yeah.
We've got to intervene to prevent we're just responding to the symptoms, and we can do that and we can get better at it, but it's not going to change the outcome for that young person or the family, because as I said, what's happened to that young person 5 years ago who's now 20?
Yeah.
What was happening to them when they were 0 to 3, 0 to 5 that's caused that behaviour in the first place? That's where we've got to reframe and reshake up our whole system. I think we're part of that, and happy to be engaged with a really good look at how do we change and reframe our system response in both those situations.
Well, that sounds fantastic, and hopefully we can get other organisations on board to try and look at those sorts of areas. Just a final question for you, Dean. If you were to have one wish regarding this issue of responding to young people who use violence in the home, what might that be?
I think the wish for me is actually just having safe options for the young person and for the family. And we have a role in that, but that's ultimately what we all should be working towards. What are the safe options that protect that young person? What are the safe options that protect the people within the family? And then how do we provide that support and intervention that's immediate to try and address some of the risks that they are faced with? And how do we try and repair some of that damage within the family violence within the family context?
Thank you for your insight and thoughts, Assistant Commissioner Dean McWhirter, and for your positive actions that you and VicPol are doing in this area and taking on board as an organisation. So thank you for your time today, and I look forward to seeing how we can actually help each other.
Thanks, Jane. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you.